Let's now talk about the ways that we can access and manage our resources. We've already learned about the first way, which is the Azure portal. This is where we have spent now most of our time in, and actually this is a very good way to learn Azure because it's a graphical interface. We can see everything in a graphical way, everything is very easy to manage, and it's a great way to learn Azure in general. So this Azure portal, it's important to remember, this is a browser-based graphical interface. This means we can access the Azure portal from any device that has access to a browser. It doesn't matter if it's our phone, if it's a tablet, if it's a Windows machine, if it's a Linux machine. It doesn't really matter what the operating system is, what the device is. As long as there's a browser, we can access the Azure portal. And the benefit of the Azure portal, as mentioned, we have a graphical interface. It's very easy to learn Azure and also to just navigate this. It's super easy. A similar way is to use the Azure mobile app. This is just a little bit more limited in terms of the capabilities, but we can also access this by using the Android phone or an iOS phone. So in here, it is also accessible for both the Android and iOS. And of course, this can be a great fit if we are just somewhere traveling and we still want to have a convenient way to quickly making some changes. On the other side, the downsides of the Azure portal are that it can be really tedious to implement some bulk tasks. So if we, for example, have to create 150 virtual machines, maybe even in the exact same way, then doing this just manually through the Azure portal is really a tedious task, and it's not recommended to do it like this. Also, if we want to have some repeatable tasks that should be exactly always the same, then doing this over and over again manually is just prone to some mistakes, and therefore it is not ideal also for these kind of repeatable tasks, for automations or some bulk creations. In this case, we should rather use the Azure CLI or the Azure PowerShell. These are command line tools that we now want to have a look at also in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we've seen that we can use the Azure portal, of course, to learn Azure and to create resources in a very easy way. But now if we have some bulk tasks and we want to automate things by using scripts, then we want to have a look also at the Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell. So what are these two tools that we can also use? These are, first of all, in general, command line tools that allow us to create and manage resources, create services, and configure them also. So everything that we can do in the Azure portal, we can also do by using these command line tools. This is a very good way if we have some repeatable tasks or some bulk creation. For example, if we need to create 50 resources in the exact same way, we shouldn't use that Azure portal, but we should use one of these two command line tools. These two tools work cross-platform. This means that we can install them on Windows, on Mac OS, and also on Linux. The functionality is actually very similar. There are some very subtle differences, but overall, everything that we want to do, we can usually also do in both of these tools. And the main thing in which those two tools are different is just that they have a little bit of a different syntax. So the question is now, how would we choose which tool is the better fit for us? This is mainly depending on our previous experience. So if you are a Windows user, you might be more familiar with the syntax of PowerShell, and if you are more used to Linux, then you might be more familiar and it might just feel more natural to you to use the Azure CLI. So this is mainly how you can choose which one to use, but both of them work very well. So let's quickly summarize that. The Azure CLI is similar to Bash scripting, and this is the reason why if you mainly work with Linux systems, this just feels more like a natural fit to use this Azure CLI with the syntax that is more similar to Bash scripting. Azure PowerShell, on the other side, is mainly if you are used to working with Windows systems, then it just feels more natural to you. This can also be just used in the Windows PowerShell. So just to give you a quick understanding and impression on how these two syntax look different, and don't worry, you don't need to memorize the exact commands here. This is just to give you an impression on how they look different. So you see on the left side, there's the Azure CLI, and this always starts with AZ in the beginning. This is what you can remember, that Azure CLI just starts with AZ, and this is how you can distinguish between those two commands. So when you see AZ, you know it will be the Azure CLI in Bash. And now, before we also have a look at how this works in practice, we just quickly want to see how we can install them. So as mentioned, you can use the Windows PowerShell also for the Azure PowerShell. So you can just open this up in your Windows system, and then you can just install the Azure PowerShell by using this command. Again, you don't need to memorize that. And if you want to do that yourself, you will also find instructions on how to do this just by searching in Google for install Azure PowerShell. You will find the first result, which is just this one, and there you can also just copy this command, and this will quickly install the Azure PowerShell, and then you can use your Windows PowerShell to execute all of those commands. You can of course then sign into your account by using your credentials, and then you can manage your resources. The same is true also for the Azure CLI. It's also very simple to install it. You can again use some commands in the PowerShell to install it. So again, you can use PowerShell to install the Azure CLI, or you can even just download this installation file with the Windows installer package. So this can be also very easily downloaded and installed. So Azure CLI installation is also very easy. We can install it and run it also from Windows command prompt or PowerShell as well. And we will see in all of the commands AZ in the beginning. But now there's a way that is even easier to use the Azure CLI and the Azure PowerShell, and this is the Azure Cloud Shell. All we need is to set up a dedicated storage account, and then we can just access the PowerShell or the Azure CLI by using our Azure portal. And this is very easy to find. We have to just go to this little icon at the top, and this will open up then the Cloud Shell. If we are using this for the first time, as mentioned, we need to mount a dedicated storage account, and then we can use either Azure CLI or the Azure PowerShell. And now in the next lecture, we just want to have a quick demonstration on how we can use this Azure Cloud Shell. Let's now quickly also have a look at how we can use the Azure Cloud Shell. This is a very convenient way to use either Azure CLI in Bash or the Azure PowerShell. And we can access this through using this little button in here. This is in the Azure portal where we can find this icon where it says also Cloud Shell. If we click on this, we will see that this will lead us to either using Bash, so this means the Azure CLI, or to PowerShell. If we want to, for example, use PowerShell, we can select it, and there we have, as we have learned in the previous lecture, that we have to first mount a storage account, because the Azure Cloud Shell requires a file share just to persist files in a session. This is why we can now either create a new storage account, or we can also go to show advanced settings and use an existing one. So for example, we can say we want to create a new resource group. Let's call this resource group Cloud Shell 1 maybe, and then we can also use a storage account. So for example, a new one, we can say, for example, storage, and then we can say AZ Cloud and maybe a number. And then we can also do the same thing for the file share. So we can also say file share and then maybe a sequence of numbers. And afterwards, we can also, of course, the region we could change or we could leave it. In my case, this is now all good. And we just quickly want to create this storage account. And afterwards we are connected, and we can now just choose to use either PowerShell or Bash. So this would work as well. Switching will just reconnect, so this is okay for us. And then we could also use here the Azure CLI. In our case, we can just, for example, use the PowerShell. And I have a few commands that we can just see to just get an idea of how this works, to just have a quick demonstration. For example, we can say that we want to get a list of all of the virtual machines. And this is why we can just execute this very simple command. I can just paste that in here, and then I can execute this command. And I see that there is, in our case, one resource that is a virtual machine, and we can see what is the location and so on and so forth. And the same thing we can also do in the Azure CLI. So in here, let's use this command that is for the Azure CLI. We can again just paste it, and then we can also execute this command from here, where we can now see it in a little bit of a different format. So this looks more like a JSON format, but we can see the same information in here as well. And then if we want to minimize this, we can maybe do something, have a look around, and then we can open this up later on again. And if we are closing that, we have to do some stuff. We have a look at our resources. We can just always again open this up and then use that again. So this is very easy to access just from the Azure portal. We don't have to install anything. We just have to mount a storage account, and then we can use that in a very easy way. We can use either Bash in the Azure CLI or the PowerShell as well. So this was just a quick demonstration on how we can use and access the Azure Cloud Shell. Let's talk about Azure Arc. Azure Arc is a solution that allows us to manage our resources from different cloud providers like Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud, and also from our on-premise data center. Because nowadays, most companies, they don't only use services from one single cloud provider, but they may have some resources in their own on-premise data center. Then they may also get some services from other cloud providers like Google Cloud or AWS. And then they may even have some edge IoT devices. And to manage all of these complex environments in a consistent way, so we may have the same security that we want to have, the same compliance and the same governance all across these different platforms. And of course, this can be very challenging. And this is the solution that Azure Arc offers. We can get a unified experience and map all of the resources from those different environments. And like this, we get a centralized management platform for multi-cloud, on-premise, and our edge devices. Like this, we achieve a unified experience because we can map our resources that are not created in Azure through the so-called Azure Resource Manager, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. And like this, we get a unified experience, and we can see all of our resources just in the Azure cloud, even if they are from other cloud providers or if they are from on-premise. We can even create our own custom location. So our data center is maybe not really a location that is available in the Azure cloud, and therefore we can create this as our own custom location. And like this, we achieve a consistent management, governance, and security. This is the main benefit that we achieve with the Azure Arc platform. And we can manage not all of the resources, but very important resources like virtual machines, SQL servers, and Kubernetes clusters. This is what we can all map into Azure Arc and then manage those resources from multi-cloud or on-premise as well. And to give you a quick impression on how this looks like, let's quickly jump into the Azure portal. And here we can find the service Azure Arc, which we can just access as any other service as well. And in here, we can now see and manage all of our on-premise infrastructure, as well as the other clouds and edge devices. And the great thing is that there's no charge to start. We can just add our infrastructure and then start to manage it from here. In here we could now start to add some infrastructure as mentioned for free. So for example, we could add some servers, so some physical servers from our on-premise data center. So this could be done by just generating a script that we will then execute on our local device. Of course, we have here the quick explanation on how this works. And the same thing we can also do, for example, for SQL servers. We get again here the prerequisites. So we need a virtual machine. And then on this virtual machine, we can, for example, install PowerShell. And then we will get a script. This will be just generated in here. And this can be then executed to onboard those SQL server into Azure Arc. This is what we can do, and then we can see all of our resources in here and we can manage them, which is really, really great. And then also, as mentioned, we can create our own custom location because our local data center is most likely not a location in Azure. And this is why we can also create a custom location in here as well. And under infrastructure, we see all of the services that we can currently add into Azure Arc. And also we have some services for data services and application services. And if we have a look at the pricing, we can again see that this can be done without any additional cost. So we can just bring them in, we can start completely for free and see all of our infrastructure in the Azure Arc platform. And then, of course, only we have to pay for the services, the resources themselves. And also, if we want to use some additional paid services, we can do that. But in general, just to get started and see and map all of our resources, this comes with no additional cost. So this is the Azure Arc that we can use to see and manage all of our on-premise infrastructure, as well as the other main public cloud providers and our edge devices. Now let's have a closer look at the so-called Azure Resource Manager. This is a very important topic because this is the actual management layer in which we create and update our resources. So whenever we create any resource, may it be a virtual machine, a SQL database, an app service, it will always send a request to the Azure Resource Manager. And this is now where the resource is actually created. And it doesn't matter where we do this. Might it be through the Azure portal, the Azure CLI, or PowerShell. It will always work the same way. Always the request will be sent to the resource manager where the resource is then actually created. So this is our central and consistent management layer in which all of the resources are actually created. And something that is really great about this Azure Resource Manager is that we can generate and use so-called ARM templates. Those are JSON files that contain the exact configuration of our resources. So ARM, of course, stands for Azure Resource Manager, and those are text files, JSON files that contain the exact configuration, and this is therefore important in helping us when we want to redeploy existing solutions. We can generate those files from existing solutions and then quickly redeploy them. We can do this through the, of course, Azure CLI, for example, or PowerShell, but we can even use that in the Azure portal directly. And then we can use that to generate these resources over and over again. So for example, if we want to create 100 virtual machines, we better do this by using those ARM templates. But now there's also another reason why those ARM templates are important. And this is because with those, we can define dependencies. If we have a very complex environment, for example, a resource group with multiple resources, maybe a virtual machine, then a web application which needs this virtual machine, and then also maybe a SQL database that will also be needed from the web application. So this is a complex situation where the resources need to be created in a specific sequence because there's this dependency and these resources need each other. And this can be also defined in those ARM templates. And we can even, if we have an existing resource group, for example, an existing dependency, we can also automatically generate this template so that everything will be created in the correct order with the correct dependencies. So to redeploy existing solutions with complex dependencies, these ARM templates can be very useful. So this is what we need to know about the Azure Resource Manager and the ARM templates. And now we want to also have a quick look at how this looks like in practice. If we want to create any resource, so for example a virtual machine, we have already in our case one existing virtual machine. And now if we have a look at this and we decide that we need to create the exact same virtual machine again, how can we do this? Of course, it is very complex to see what is the exact configuration here and there, but we can also use an ARM template. We can find this if we scroll down in this resource to automation, and there we can say export template. Then you see this template will be generated. We can now just download this file, or we can also add it to the library so we can reuse that later again. So for example, we can say this is custom VM, this works, and then we can also specify a version, and afterwards we can just review and create this template. So if we have this created, we can reuse this to deploy this over and over again. So if we want to do this, we can search for deploy custom template. So deploy custom, we find the service, and in here we can go to change that from the quick start template, and there we can just select an existing template. So in our case, this is that custom VM. We have version number 1, and this can be then selected, and now we can just go ahead and also define, of course, a resource group, the region, the name. These things we could also still change, and then we could go ahead and review and create this resource. But if we now have a more complex environment, for example, we go to the resource groups, and let's say we have a couple of resources in a given resource group. For example, let's go just to this resource group where we have a few resources included. Now they may depend on each other. And now what we can do is we can also, under the resource group, also go to export template, and there also a template will be generated. And you see that there are now multiple resources, and all of the dependencies will be already defined in this template. So this will be created correctly. And you remember that even the Azure blueprints, they also use those ARM templates to set up the resources, especially if the environment is a bit more complex. So we have some dependencies between the resources. This is the Azure Resource Manager as well as the so-called ARM templates. Congratulations on completing almost the last module, which we now quickly want to summarize again so that we remember what was important in this module. First, we've talked about the Azure portal. These are ways to access the resources, manage the resources, and of course, this is the way that we use in the beginning ideally, because it is very easy to learn due to this web-based graphical interface. So this is very good in the beginning to learn how everything works, and the Azure portal can be accessed by any device that has access to a browser, because the Azure portal is accessed through a browser. And also we have the Azure mobile app. This is just convenient, for example, when we are traveling and we want to make some small adjustments, but of course it's not so convenient for larger tasks or even bulk deployment. This is when we want to use Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell. These are the two cross-platform command line tools. This means we can use them on Linux, Windows, and they are very good if we want to bulk deploy. Azure CLI scripting is similar to Bash, and you remember we can recognize a command for that with the AZ command in the beginning. And as mentioned, this is very good for bulk deployment. If we want to create 100 resources, 100 virtual machines, we can use this Azure CLI to quickly deploy them and repeat our tasks. Also, we've talked about the Azure Cloud Shell, which is just a way to access the Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell, because we can just go to the Azure portal and then from there just access one of those command line tools like Azure CLI or PowerShell. Then we've also talked about Azure Arc. This is to manage our hybrid and multi-cloud, because we probably have resources not only in Azure, but we may also have resources still in our on-premise data center. So we can map them into Azure Arc and then manage them from there, but also from other cloud providers like AWS or GCP and also edge devices. This can all be managed and therefore function as our centralized platform for consistent management, governance, and security. And then in the end, we've also talked about the Azure Resource Manager, which is the management layer that is used to create, update, and deploy resources. Every resource that gets created goes through the Azure Resource Manager. And also, very important, the ARM templates. They are JSON files that can be generated. We can also write them if we want manually, but they are a little bit more complex, and they contain all of the configuration of a resource and how it is created. We can use that very conveniently for redeploying existing solutions, or also to deploy maybe 100 virtual machines in the exact same way. And also we can create and define dependencies. So how should these resources depend on each other? What is the sequence? And for example, we can generate also those dependencies from an existing resource group in which there are already a couple of resources with dependencies. So in such situations, those ARM templates are very, very useful. This is what we have learned in this module. I hope it was helpful and you're excited about the last module, which we are going to have a look at next.